right, joining us now, Democratic Mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg. How'd I do?
You got it.
All right, he launched a presidential exploratory committee last night. We discovered we have this in common. I'm always Micah, and is the author of a new memoir entitled Shortest Way Home, One Mayor's Challenge, and a model for America's future. Joe?
It's very interesting. Yeah, you're always Micah, but as Alex just said in my ear, but what? People Mel Brzezinski?
Exactly.
That's even tougher. So, Mr. Mayor, we'll do a rapid round really quickly just to introduce you to everybody. We'll hit all the hot button issues right now and let Democratic voters know where you stand. Let's start with your ideology first for people who don't know where you stand. Would you say that you're more liberal or less liberal than AOC, Nancy Pelosi? Where are you on the ideological spectrum?
I consider myself a pretty strong progressive, but I also don't consider the left-center spectrum to be the most useful way to look at our politics right now, because I think it's gotten jumbled up both by the current president and by the pace of change.
So do you consider yourself more of a centrist?
Again, I don't find these labels very helpful, but I would consider myself more of a progressive than a centrist. Look, in South Bend, I wouldn't be able to govern effectively if I couldn't work well with independents and Republicans. But I didn't do it by pretending to be more conservative than I am. I actually don't believe that the best way to reach independence today is through ideological centrism. I mean, mathematically, you look at the numbers in my county, and it's very clear that there are a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and me, which indicates that voters, especially voters in the heartland where I come from, don't necessarily make their decisions by just lining everybody up on an ideological spectrum and then looking for the dot that's closest to where they are. But yeah, push come to shove, in terms of my orientation, I'm going to come at most of these policy questions from a progressive angle.
All right.
Go
ahead, Joe.
Well, I just wanted to ask also, Donald Trump's been pushing, as have Republicans, has been pushing the line that Democrats want to turn America into a socialist country.
Yeah.
Do you think moving towards socialism is a positive step for the Democratic Party? Do you think moving towards socialism is a positive step for the Democratic Party?
I think it's a word in American politics that has basically lost all meaning. And that began when a conservative proposal, the Affordable Care Act, which was developed in the Heritage Foundation, began to be described as socialist by conservatives who were opposing it. Look, I know that for years socialism has been used as a kill switch to just stop an idea from being talked about. But I think if you're from my generation, the real interest is an idea good or not? And I think Democrats are going to be willing to talk about ideas that somebody might try to demolish by claiming they're socialist, but we don't care whether it reads to some conservatives as more socialist or not. We care about whether it works.
So does capitalism work? Does American capitalism work?
Yeah, American capitalism is the most productive economic force known to man. But we also know that it can create massive inequality, and frankly, it can destroy itself if you don't have, as one law school puts it, the wise constraints that make people free, right? I think there's a generation of people who grew up at a time when you had communism and socialism on one side, you had democracy and capitalism on the other. I think today we're negotiating the tensions between democracy and capitalism. I'm committed to democracy. And the biggest thing we have to ask ourselves is, if there is a tension between them, do you care about capitalism more than about democracy? Or do you care about democracy more than you care about capitalism?
Final lightning question round, then I'll turn it back over to Micah Brzezinski.
Yeah.
So, do you support the late-term abortion legislation that was passed in the New York State Legislature, as well as in Virginia?
I don't think we need more restrictions right now. And, what I've learned in Indiana, being at a place where a lot of my friends, a lot of my supporters even come from a different place than I do, being pro-choice. I just believe that when a woman is in that situation, and when we're talking about some of those situations covered by that law, extremely difficult, painful, often medically serious situations where the life or health of the mother is at stake, the involvement of a male government official like me is not helpful.
Do states have a right, should states have a right to ban abortion at 20 weeks?
That sounds like a constitutional question. I'm not a legal scholar. What I know is that these questions ought to be resolved by women in consultation with their doctors, not by the intervention of male politicians putting politically motivated restrictions on women's health care.
Okay, now, are you done, Joe? You done?
I am, Micah.
Yeah, Micah here. Okay, so let's talk by the way, he's got a very calming presence.
Yeah,
You're like the Mr. Rogers of the Democratic field.
Mr.
Good.
I think it was intended as a compliment.
It's a compliment. Presence. Yes, jack it off. Okay, so none of the Democratic, we've got an incredible field of candidates. They're all exciting. Nobody screams foreign policy expert to me. So I just want to ask you a random question. Besides sanctions, what other steps should the United States take to get North Korea to halt its nuclear and missile program?
Well, I think diplomatic pressure works too, right? I mean, often when you see a regime finally begin to change, it's because of the isolation that can happen from being a pariah state. Now, unfortunately, we moved in exactly the wrong direction by legitimizing their leadership in soft power terms through a summit that didn't have the right kind of preconditions. And so that, getting that back on the right track, coupled with sanctions, I mean, sanctions belong in our national security portfolio, I think is going to be a lot more effective than holding a summit, weirdly declaring that the nuclear threat is not a problem anymore, and then being embarrassingly contradicted by your own intelligence chiefs in front of Congress.
I want to bring in former Senator Claire McCaskill,
Great.
now joining our team. Claire, you have the next question.
Thank you. Mayor Pete, you've been crushing it out there. I've been paying attention. You are somebody who I think has good ideas, somebody who is executed on a local level. I think one of the most interesting things about you that I'm sure people do not know, how many languages do you speak?
It depends what you mean by speak. So I've gotten pretty rusty in my Arabic and my Dari, which I picked up Dari on my way to Afghanistan. I can still kind of read a newspaper in Norwegian, but only slow.
Wow. So you have, and you speak Spanish, you are someone who clearly has been interested in learning more and being intellectually curious. And how important do you think that is for a president of the United States?
Yeah, I think curiosity is a really important quality for leadership, being motivated to understand, to peel back the layers, to see the story behind the story. And it frightens me that we have such an incurious president right now. I don't think he's inclined to ask questions, obviously doesn't read a lot. To me, I mean, how could you be in that office and not want to use the fact that, you could have lunch with the NASA director and then an hour later be talking with the intelligence experts on any country in the world to better understand how to do your job, but also better understand the world that you live in. And by the way, one of America's great qualities is we've always been a curious country. It's part of what American innovation and entrepreneurship is built on.
So South Bend, Indiana has a population of about 100,000 people. What do you tell an American who is skeptical about handing you the keys to government, making you the commander-in-chief, the chief executive of the United States, when you, right now...
Well, Mayor, the bar is kind of low. Yeah.
Right now, when you govern a city that has the population not even a quarter of Staten Island.
Yeah, that question is fair game, but here's how I would answer it. I would say that a mayor of a city at any level has the kind of executive experience that is most relevant to that job. When you're a mayor, especially in a strong mayor system like ours, where we don't have a city manager, for example, you get the call. And it could be anything from a economic development puzzle about a multi-million-dollar deal in an industrial park to deciding whether to activate the Emergency Operations Center for a weather emergency, or an officer-involved shooting with racial tension where you've got to hold a community together. I would argue that work, being mayor of a city of any size, is arguably more relevant, and I don't mean any disrespect to Senator McCaskill's former colleagues doing good things in Washington right now, but you have very senior members of the Senate or the Congress, which I get is a more traditional path to be in this conversation, who may have never managed more than 100 people in their lives. I think it shows right now that we have a president who does not have government experience, and it may be a little cheeky for me to say this as the youngest guy in the conversation, but I've got more years of government experience than the president, more years of executive experience than the vice president, and I think it's worth something that I have more deployed military experience than anybody to arrive behind that desk since George H.W. Bush.
That sounds like a pitch there.
Okay.
I love mayors. They always say there are not Republican streetlights and Democratic potholes. There are streetlights and potholes, and the guys get it done. You mentioned at the beginning that you've had to compromise with Republicans in order to get things done in South Bend. Can you give us an example of some time you compromised with Republicans where it was hard, where you had to give something away you didn't necessarily want to, in order to improve the lives of people in your city?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I had to do was buck my own party and give political cover to Republicans in the General Assembly when they decided to do the right thing and adjust the gas tax, which is politically tough, so that we would have more funds to fill in potholes and pave streets. The party created a lot of pressure to, take some punches there because it was a tax hike. But I also knew it was the right thing to do from an infrastructure perspective, so I reached across the aisle and did it. Again, when you're a mayor, you have to work with anybody who is in a position to help your state. Needless to say, I have some very strong opinions about Mike Pence, so does my husband, but we even worked with him when it was good for the city on things like economic development.
Okay.
So I'll concede that your experience in South Bend makes you qualified to be president.
All right.
But let's go back to some of the things you said at the beginning, because whether you want to be defined along a political spectrum or not, people are going to try to define you. And you're for the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal. You're for Medicare for all, with a few asterisks. You see this tension between democracy and capitalism, which some of us don't see, or at least see that it can work out. It sounds like you're going to get defined pretty far over on the progressive spectrum.
Look, I think what we have to decide is, are we going to keep being defined by where these fence posts are, or are we going to do what the right very successfully did over the last 40 years and redefine them? Medicare for All is a great example. Again, ACA, which was a conservative proposal, came to be caricatured as left-wing by a very disciplined right-wing message machine, right? What is Medicare for All? It's a compromise. I mean, in the UK, you got national health care. That would be the left-wing, the true left-wing position. The true right-wing position is free for all corporate. And the compromise position is a single-payer system where you have private doctors but a public payer. We've got to stop allowing the right to move the goalposts and characterize the entire center of the
Respectfully, it's not the right that's moving at the moment. It's the Democrats. The Democrats are looking at all. We have 15 candidates who are trying to figure out. And so naturally, it's not surprising, and I don't think it's wrong that we try to figure out where people line up on all these important issues.
Well, absolutely.
You seem to line up closer to the left side of the page than the right side of the page within the Democratic Party. That's all.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is the page
Are you making
itself
that sound
is
dirty, Steve?
No, I wasn't trying to.
Okay, I'm saying it so accusingly.
There's this cycle that we're in the middle of, but there's also the bigger project of making sure that the center of gravity of American politics is actually lined up with the center of gravity of the American people. I mean, today, on the anniversary of the Parkland shooting, for example, you got something like universal background checks that command support from 80, maybe 90% of the American people, something that most Republicans, most gun owners are on board with. And yet, if you looked in Congress, you would think that was a left-wing position.
Right.
So, we've got to acknowledge that the right did a masterful job over the last 40 years of being willing, even if it meant losing in the short term, to pull the entire center of gravity of the American political spectrum further right than where most American people already are. Most Americans get that everybody ought to have health care. Most Americans get that wages are too low, and we got to do something about that. And I don't think it's a crazy left-wing idea that we ought to have a sense of urgency, a sense of emergency even, as somebody who's thinking about what the world's going to look like in 2054 when I get to the current age of the current president, that we got to do something about climate change that acknowledges it as an emergency that really is, in its destructive power, on par with something like the Great Depression or World War II. So of course we got to have something on the scale of the Green New Deal. That's not left-wingism, that's pragmatism.
Well, it's great to have you on, Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Thank you very much. The book, Shortest Way Home, One Mayor's Challenge, and a Model for America's Future is out now. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Come back. Claire McCann.